Hello, everybody. Happy St. Patrick's Day. And welcome to this research seminar organized by BCLT, the British Centre for Literary Translation, which is based at the University of East Anglia in Norwich, England. My name is Duncan Large, and I'm the BCLT's academic director. BCLT research seminars are all free to access, this year in the first instance via Zoom webinar, and from shortly after the event via the BCLT's channel on YouTube. So this event is being recorded. The BCLT's channel on YouTube, where you'll also find recordings of earlier seminars, sessions from our annual summer school, and so on. If this is the first time you've joined us, then you might like to subscribe to us on Eventbrite so that you'll be notified as soon as details of other events are posted. Today's speaker is Martine Hennard de la Rochère. Martine is Professor of English and Comparative Literature and former Associate Dean of the Humanities at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. Martine has published on various aspects of modern and contemporary literature, including Dickens, Conrad, Nabokov, Carter, Rushdie, Donahue, Yollen, on the international fairy tale tradition from antiquity to the present, and literary translation, theory, practice, reception. Martine is the author of Origin and Originality in Salman Rushdie's Fiction, 1999, which focuses on the poetics and politics of cultural translation, and Reading, Translating, Rewriting, Angela Carter's Translational Poetics, 2013, which traces the interplay of translation and rewriting in Carter's fiction. She guest edited Angela Carter Traductrice, Angela Carter en Traduction, 2014, and has co-edited Deep Breath, After Satan, Essays in Honor of Neil Forsyth, 2010, Des Fata aux Fées, Regards croisés de l'Antiquité à nos jours, 2011, Cinderella Across Cultures, New Directions and Interdisciplinary Perspectives, 2016, Translation and Creativity, La Traduction comme Création, 2016, Visage, Histoire, Représentation, Création, 2017, Feminine Visible, Women Authors of the Enlightenment, Übersetzen, Schreiben, Vermitteln, 2018, and La Nouvelle Jeunesse des Contes, Transcréation des recueils de Perrault et des Grimm, 2019. Martine is an international corresponding member of the British Comparative Literature Association, and she sits on the advisory boards of the Chichester Centre for Fairy Tales, Fantasy and Speculative Fiction, as well as the Angela Carter Society. Martine was awarded an honorary doctorate from the University of Angers in 2019. Now then, Martine has visited UEA before. She spoke at the Angela Carter and Japan Symposium, which my colleague Stephen Benson and visiting scholar Professor Natsumi Ikoma organized at UEA in June 2018. So it's lovely to be able to welcome Martine back, even if only remotely. More recently, Martine hosted an online international conference under the aegis of the Angela Carter Society, Angela Carter Translator, Angela Carter in Translation in October 2020, so very recently. Martine has been an absolute mainstay of the international Angela Carter scholarly community for a number of years then, and we're delighted that she agreed to talk to us today about a subject that is very dear to her heart and which also fits perfectly into our BCLT research seminar series in literary translation, not forgetting that Angela Carter herself was, of course, for a period writer in residence at the University of East Anglia. After Martine's talk, then there will be a question and answer session. So do please use the Zoom Q&A function to ask your questions and to upvote any other questions that you like so that we can make sure the most popular questions get covered. For now, though, it's my great pleasure to hand over to Martine Hennard, and her intriguing title is The Milk in the Looking Glass, Angela Carter's Translational Poetics. Martine.
Thank you so much, Duncan, for your very generous introduction and also for your kind invitation. It's a real pleasure and a great honor to be giving a lecture at the British Centre for Literary Translation as part of your prestigious research series. As you pointed out, last time I visited UEA for real was for a wonderful conference on Angela Carter and Japan, and / in Japan, actually, organized by Natsumi Ikoma and Stephen Benson. And I'm briefly going to mention this occasion today, partly as a friendly nod to my fellow Carterians, and also because if you are interested in the topic of Angela Carter and Japanese and Angela Carter in Japan, there is an issue of contemporary women's writing forthcoming in the fall. Obviously, I wish I could be with you all in the flesh, as it were, and yet somehow speaking to you through a screen is strangely apt for what I'm going to talk about today. Indeed, I'm going to use the Perraultian mirror as a guiding image and structuring device, as well as a metaphor for translation. So let me try and take you on a journey through the looking glass. There will be a lot of toing and froing between texts and languages, but that is probably what you are all accustomed to anyway, and what translational reading, la lecture traductive, is all about. It's something I guess we all cherish and value and practice, partly because it is so very stimulating. I'm going now to try and share my screen with you. Can you all see it? Yes. So yes. Fantastic. So this is not going to come as a surprise to you, I guess, but reading, translating, and writing or rewriting are closely connected and deeply intermeshed activities, and many writers have tapped into the creative and critical potential of translation to fashion their own work and also to find their own voice. Translation is a labor of love that strives to recreate a text to ensure its afterlife in another language, culture, and context, to draw on Walter Benjamin's memorable figure of thought. What is very interesting about this fascinating essay is that Benjamin tries to capture what he's trying to say in different ways. He mentions Nachleben, Überleben, and even Fortleben in Die Aufgabe des Übersetzers. So, for better or for worse, this is inevitably, translation is inevitably, necessarily a subtly transformative process, and yet one that is absolutely necessary and inherent in the afterlife and dissemination of works, including, of course, literary texts. But it's transformative as the Benjaminian concept of Nachleben, Überleben, and even Fortleben itself, demonstrates. How do you translate it? To quote Susan Bassnett, to quote Susan Bassnett, it is absurd to see translation as anything other than a creative literary activity. For translators are all the time engaging with the texts, first as readers and then as rewriters, as recreators of that text in another language. Translation was a means not only of acquiring more information about other writers and their work, but also of discovering new ways of writing, end quote. And this is what I'm going to focus on today. Another quote, this time by Kazim Ali, who adds, I quote, "The trick of translation is that the act of it transforms everyone, the original text, the new language, the author, and the translator all," end quote. The complex interplay of repetition and difference that characterizes translation captures an age-old paradox that has long exercised the human mind and, as we all know, fueled fierce debates. Translation is both impossible and necessary, inherent in any human literary and cultural exchange. Or to put it differently, it's an endless task. To quote Barbara Cassin in Le vocabulaire européen de philosophie, Dictionnaire des intraduisibles, first published in 2004, l'intraduisible, c'est plutôt ce qu'on ne cesse pas de traduire, but also ce qu'on ne cesse pas de ne pas traduire. End of quote. Barbara, and I would like to mention it, has recently authored a chapter in Duncan Lodge's edited book on untranslatability, published by Routledge in 2019, in order to pursue, this kind of conversation about untranslatability. In the Vocabulaire européen des philosophies, she explains that what is at stake is no less than a new way of doing philosophy. I quote, « Nous avons voulu penser la philosophie en langue et voir ce que cela change dans nos manières de philosopher. » And accordingly, the dictionary draws attention to the linguistic, historical, and intellectual specificity of seemingly self-evident concepts, such as, for instance, truth, vérité, Wahrheit, pravda, and so on and so forth. So using translation as an epistemological tool, Barbara Cassin is indeed calling for a translational, or we could call it philological, turn in philosophy, and more generally in the humanities today. And of course, she's not the first thinker to have reflected on translation and its philosophical implications. Benjamin, Jacobson, and Derrida, to mention just a few, sort of paved the way for her. But nevertheless, we can see that it's a very topical issue to think about today. Similarly, many writers have used translation as a speculative tool and as a heuristic process, and even as a creative method to experiment with new ways of writing and thinking, marked by patterns of influence, imitation, borrowing, reconfiguration, appropriation, reinterpretation, differentiation, and response. Not only is translation the most intimate form of close reading, when it is done rigorously, of course, but it generates new ideas, new forms, new genres, and it is centrally bound up with creativity. This is amply confirmed by a number of genres. Let's only mention the history of the sonnet or children's literature, as Gillian Leahy has amply demonstrated. Even the development of many individual oeuvres and styles owes a lot more to translation than we might think. For instance, on this slide, you can find a patchwork of familiar or perhaps not so familiar faces, including Chaucer, who famously translated Boethius and the Roman de la Rose, Ezra Pound, a translator of Latin and Chinese, Rabindranath Tagore, Baudelaire, Rilke, Mallarmé, Pasternak, Proust, Borges, Collodi, Tolkien, Nabokov, Beckett, Calvino, Nancy Houston, Seamus Heaney, Don Patterson, Lydia Davis, to name but a few. I could also mention, though his name is not on the screen, I apologize for this, but Philippe Jacotet, who died a week or so ago, the Swiss poet who was also a renowned translator. So all of them practice translation or self-translation, and this informed and filtered through their own work in different ways. And yet, the history of these complex circulations, borrowings, reconfigurations, crossings, and transformations has long remained invisible in favor of national and political agendas, and perhaps also as a result of monolingual scholarship and disciplinary boundaries. But of course, the focus of my talk today is Angela Carter, 1940-1992, who was a fiction writer, journalist, cultural critic, editor, and essayist. Here you even have a picture of her on the cover of an issue of The Messenger, the European English Messenger, at the time edited by Neil Forsyth, who happened to be my PhD thesis director, and whom I salute if he is in the audience. And in this picture, you can see Angela Carter complete with a pack of the French cigarettes Gitane that eventually killed her. Gitane are nicknamed coffin nails, so Carter should have watched out for those. Anyway, she had a kind of French tropism, as I'm going to show, that centrally informed her own work. Even though Carter has been comically nicknamed Angela of the campus, owing to the sheer number of doctoral theses written about her work since the 1980s, scholars have tended to neglect her work as a translator, partly because most of it is still unpublished to this day. So basically you have to dig into the archives to find them. And also because Carter didn't mean to publish most of them. She used translation for a different purpose, for the most part. As it happens, however, Carter translated fairly extensively from the French, and this activity played a key role in her development as a writer. Not unrelatedly, Carter saw herself as a speculative writer who explored ideas in fictional form. Hence, the guiding metaphor of my talk, namely Alice's looking glass, to capture the nature, role, and work of translation in her fiction. In what follows, I will give a few examples of how Carter used translation as an integral part of her writing process. And I will try and briefly trace the interplay of translation and rewriting in her fiction based on her lifelong, and we could say even stormy, passion for Charles Baudelaire and the fairy tale tradition, especially, but not only, those by Charles Perrault. The fairy tale is also related to the foundational Carolian intertext, if only because Carroll described in his correspondence the Alice books as extended fairy tales. And interestingly enough, the Alice books run through Carter's life and work from her early childhood to her poetry in her 20s and on to her posthumously published volume of short stories, American Ghosts and Old World Wonders. In short, the Carolian looking glass will serve as a metaphor for Carter's experience of reading and translating foreign texts as a key source of inspiration. Angela Carter, for those who have never heard of her, was probably one of the most daring, thought-provoking, original, and influential British authors of the post-war period. Many contemporary writers, but also visual artists, filmmakers, theater directors, think about Emma Rice at the Globe, but even singers, Björk, PJ Harvey, Laura Marling, have paid homage to Carter. Scholars also have dedicated their book to Angela Carter, including Jack Zipes and Marina Warner. So Carter's fiction has had a very interesting influence, not only on the work of writers and artists, but including on scholarship, fairy tale scholarship itself. Carter was also a published translator, if only a very short, small section of her translations have come out in book form, but she published her translation of the fairy tales of Charles Perrault. And as I mentioned before, I'm currently working on the Angela Carter archive at the British Library, working on her unpublished material. As a matter of fact, Carter found inspiration in reading, translating, and rewriting across languages, but also across genres and media. Here you see that the translation work generated the rewritings, quote unquote, for adults in the Bloody Chamber, but Carter went on to adapt some of them as radio plays, and eventually worked with Neil Jordan for a film, The Company of Forbes, released in 1984, based on several of her fairy tale rewritings. So we could even go so far as to argue that Angela Carter exemplifies Roman Jakobson's threefold model of translation in his famous essay on linguistic aspects of translation, namely interlingual, intralingual, and intersemiotic translation. Turning the biblical prohibition against mixing old and new wine on its head, Carter declared in an essay, in a kind of programmatic essay entitled Notes from the Front Line, I quote, "Reading is just as creative an activity as writing, and most intellectual development depends upon new readings of old texts. I am all for putting new wine in old bottles, especially if the pressure of the new wine makes the old bottles explode," end quote. And so Carter used translation as a close reading method before producing a new reading that wrote back to the translated text, as in The Bloody Chamber and other stories, the collection of dark, daring, erotic, woman-centered, and densely intertextual stories about fairy stories, as she called them, that she wrote alongside with and in response to her translation in the fairy tales of Charles Perrault, which was published in 1977, so 2 years before the collection of fairy tale rewritings for adults. So Carter's collection of fairy tale rewritings can be said to have started a fashion that is still in vogue today. Think Emma Donoghue, Janet Winterson, China Mieville, Neil Gaiman, Francesca Lia Bloch, and Helen Oyeyemi, to name a few, many of whom have actually paid tribute to Angela Carter. The Bloody Chamber famously revisits, transposes, and reimagines the familiar stories of Bluebeard, Little Red Riding Hood, Sleeping Beauty, Puss in Boots, and Beauty in the Beast, all of which she had previously translated. This was part of Carter's demythologizing feminist project. I mean, her words are, to quote her words, "I am in the demythologizing business." as an attempt, if you like, to undo the foundational myths and archetypes of femininity that make people unfree, as she put it herself. And yet, the more she researched the old stories, the more she discovered that they were far more complex than she might have thought. And so she ended up radically critiquing alternative feminist myths and received ideas about the fairy tale tradition itself. As it turns out, Carter used translation and rewriting to work out ideas throughout her life, from Middle English poetry to French contes de fées, from Baudelaire's Fleur du Mal to Xavier Gautier's Surréalisme et Sexualité. She even contemplated a career as a translator from the French in her mid-20s. In her 1965-1966 journal, she writes, "What I want to do, write Nightscape, learn French well enough to translate it, do something more about learning about painting, and finally, think about translating Mandeville's travels." At first, I think that translation was a kind of school exercise to improve her French. She indeed studied English at the University of Bristol and even specialized in medieval literature. But this activity soon became an intrinsic part of her writing and thinking process as she engaged with texts in more and more depth and detail and also in context, and started exploring new narrative possibilities. As far as fairy tales are concerned, for instance, she started asking herself what if questions. What if Little Red Riding Hood laughed at the wolf when he pounces on her and slept with him instead? What if Bluebeard was a wealthy art collector as well as a serial killer? And what if the bride told her version of the familiar story? And so on and so forth. Increasingly, it meant also going against the grain of received ideas about Sade, about surrealism, about Perrault and the fairy tale genre. In this sense, translation can be seen as an ethics of reading, resisting ideological agendas and critical commonplaces. For instance, Perrault was not a white bourgeois, chauvinist, sexist pig, as Carter found out when she read the Contes du Temps Passé in French and in context. So this allowed her to engage in a controversy about the fairy tale genre and its sexual politics with Andrea Dworkin, Patricia Dunker, and Susan Kapler, to name a few. More interestingly, this enabled her to fashion her own elusive, Baroque, versatile style, which we could even call a self-consciously foreign style, which is informed by foreign languages. Just as the formulaic genre of the fairy tale combined formal constraints and imaginative freedom in the retelling process, translation functioned as a kind of écriture à contrainte that stimulated her own creativity and enabled her to find her own voice. There were a number of key events in Angela Carter's life and creative encounters, if you like. And I have identified some of them for you. I think that one of them that really marked her was, as a writer, and that played a significant role in fashioning her distinctive style and creative method, was the shock of discovering Baudelaire's poetry as a teenager when her French teacher, Miss Siverette, lent her a record of Baudelaire and Rimbaud's poems. This was a kind of epiphany which made her want to become a writer. She says, and this is a quote from Andrew Gordon's biography of Angela Carter, that record was my trigger. It was like having my skull opened with a tin opener and all its contents transformed, end of quote. The striking metaphor of the opened skull itself may owe something to Baudelaire's mindscape imagery in Spleen. Quand le ciel bas et lourd pèse comme un couvercle sur l'esprit gémissant en proie aux longs ennuis, sur mon crâne incliné plante un drapeau noir. I mean, you probably remember those lines. But of course, as always, Carter twists the image itself and turns it into something that is also, at least partly, comic, parodic, surreal, and somewhat, trivial or prosaic. This first encounter with Baudelaire's poems, which she went on to learn by heart, I quote, as if they were pop songs, was the starting point of her fascination with French as a language, literature, culture, and intellectual tradition. Carter indeed jotted down in her journal for 1962, I quote, I am very, very weary of English literature, end of quote. So to get away from the Leavisite great tradition that she comically described as the, I quote, eat up your broccoli approach to fiction, end of quote, Carter embraced Charles Baudelaire and a whole number of other transgressive authors associated with Baudelaire and the decadent movement and the surrealist movement as well, including Sade, Bataille, Breton, Jane Mansour, Dorothea Tanning, Leonora Carrington, and Frida Kahlo. She refers to Baudelaire's Les Fleurs du Mal in a diary entry dated 1st of November 1961, so she was 21, looking back on her adolescent passion for the poet with abrasive humor and a good dose of self-mockery, but returning to his poetry all the same. And she's going to do that, over and over, basically throughout her life. I quote, when I was young and inexperienced, remember that she was 21. I don't know if it's self-irony or not as well. Anyway, when I was young and inexperienced, I adored Baudelaire because he was such a luscious, juicy phony. Rereading Spleen, I got scared, not because of the terrifying vision. It still seems overdone and melodramatic. Plante sur mon crâne son drapeau noir, indeed. But because a man who will go to these lengths simply to frighten himself is indeed in a horrifying state of mind, end quote. What is also interesting is that this quotation is immediately preceded by a reference to Edgar Allan Poe's Annabel Lee, which suggests that Carter was aware of the role played by translation in Baudelaire's own poetry, including his borrowing of the English word spleen to capture its dominant mood, his borrowing of Poe's phrase for the title of his anti-memoirs, Mon cœur mis à nu, and his experiments in poetic prose. Baudelaire, indeed, as you probably know, translated Poe's The Raven into prose, let alone, of course, Poe's short stories, fantastic tales. And he even wrote Les Petits Poèmes en prose, also known as Le Spleen de Paris, in counterpoint to Les Fleurs du Mal. So Baudelaire's name often crops up in Carter's notebooks, usually in connection with surrealism. She read widely in this area, including critical studies on poetry, art, and cinema, that all had a profound impact on her work. She even took the trouble to read Marcel Raymond's study entitled De Baudelaire au Surréalisme, which she read in English and even took the trouble to look up in French. Carter would subsequently translate several poems from Les Fleurs du Mal, as well as a dozen texts from Le Spleen de Paris, though they are still unpublished. Some poems from Les Fleurs du Mal, however, inspired the short story Black Venus, which includes a translation of Baudelaire's poem Sed non satiata, which Carter even reproduces in full and in French at the end of the tale. The story that Carter tells, the short story, the story in prose, is told from the perspective of Jeanne Dutheil, Baudelaire's Creole mistress and muse, nicknamed Vénus Noire by Baudelaire's own mother. Here you have a drawing of her by Baudelaire. The short story is arguably based on a pun, I think, Carter bringing down to earth Baudelaire's poetic ode to Venus and even its prose rewriting in The Fool and Venus. She is also obviously responding to some of Baudelaire's aphorisms in Mon cœur mis à nu, including, I quote one of them or two of them, l'éternelle Vénus, caprice, hystérie, fantaisie, est une des formes séduisantes du diable. Another one, I think I've had, yes, I have it. La femme est le contraire du dandy. Donc, elle doit faire horreur. La femme a faim et elle veut manger. Soif, elle veut boire. Elle est en rude, elle veut être... ... Le beau mérite. La femme est naturelle, c'est-à-dire abominable. End quote. This is an aphorism in Baudelaire's journal, Mon cœur mis à nu, published in 1887, so after Baudelaire's death. Baudelaire didn't intend his journal to be published, so it was published posthumously and against his will. Anyway, Carter associates Baudelaire's deep ambivalence towards women as simultaneously sublime and abject, divine and demonic, incarnated in Venus, capital V, with the venereal disease that probably killed both the poet and his muse, namely syphilis. In her fictional reworking of the Jeanne Dutheil cycle of poems, then, Carter vindicates Jeanne as she comically deflates the drama or melodrama of Baudelaire's religious agonies about sexuality as evil and women as temptresses. Taking him at his word, as it were, Carter brings his tortured idealism down to earth by describing an aging Jeanne Dutheil who returns to Martinique, lights her cheroots with drafts of Baudelaire sonnets, and happily sells her body to colonial officials, and thus spreads, I quote, the veritable, the authentic, the true Baudelairean syphilis, end of quote. Through Jeanne, Carter, of course, is also making fun of her own infatuation with Baudelaire as a venereal disease of sorts, a virus that affected her since adolescence and that she never quite managed to get rid of. The second crucial episode in her life and work, which was a truly transformative experience, was her stay in Japan between 1969 and 1971. And that's the reference to the conference that was hosted by UEA. This stay made her even more keenly aware of the complex relationship between language, self, and reality. In her 1969 journal, she quotes from Wittgenstein. She takes notes from Wittgenstein, including, of course, the famous pronouncement, "The limits of my language mean the limits of my world." It's from the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. Carter, as many of you know, tried to learn Japanese, but despite the lessons of her boyfriend, Sozo Araki, she never succeeded in mastering the language. I mean, no wonder. No wonder. My son has been trying for the past 10 years, and it takes a lifetime and more when you're not a native speaker, I guess. However, living in Japan made Carter reflect on ideograms as a system of visual signs, and she describes Tokyo as a maze-like hall of mirrors and reflections in which she loses herself. She was also very much influenced by Roland Barthes' semiotics and emulated his essays in mythologies in her own cultural criticism. So the world as signs to be deciphered. Interestingly, Carter also used a Japanese word as a creative matrix for her collection of Japan-inspired short fiction fireworks. I believe, or at least I have tried to argue, that fireworks is composed like a bouquet, after the Japanese word hanabi, literally fire flower, which describes the summer festival famous for its extraordinary fireworks. In her 1970 notebook, Carter sees the Hanabi Festival as the epitome of Japanese culture and aesthetics. I quote, "The word for firework is hanabi, fire flower. They are the morning glories of the night and possess that quality of evanescence which gives Japan its unquestionable tragic style and its amazing, death-defying elegance, that of a Baudelairean dandy," Baudelaire again, "who has made of artifice a kind of heroism. For this is a great country for appearances, and it is often hard to tell what is real and what is not. And now, watch out," she adds, "goodbye, Plato, au revoir, Descartes, auf Wiedersehen, Hegel, you did swell." So relinquishing this European rationalist tradition in three languages. So, as you have just noticed, Baudelaire is still present in Japan, albeit in transmuted fashion, filtered through Carter's experience of Japan, of course. Carter describes her lover, Sozo Araki, with whom she's hopelessly in love, as a Baudelairean dandy, handsome and fickle, and he even comes to embody Japan itself and Tokyo in particular, its seductions and dangers, including the danger of losing herself. In Japan, a deeply patriarchal society, she also learned, as she says in notes from the front line, I think, what it is to be a woman, and became radicalized. In the same essay, Carter discusses how her encounter with Japanese culture troubled and denaturalized her sense of self as the other of the other. And she says, it led me to the slow process, I quote, of decolonizing my language and my habits of thought, end of quote. And in this other excerpt from the manuscript or notebook of Japan, I think we can see how Carter went from one language to another. I mean, translated and even transliterated from English to French to Japanese and back as a creative method. Under fireworks, we can see that she jotted down feu d'artifice, so literally translating fireworks and feu d'artifice, and then artificial fire, hanabi, flower fire, and then it becomes more dynamic, if you like, flowering fire, evanescent morning glories of the night, which in falling dissolve. So the word and her meditation on those words across languages gradually comes alive, if you like. The stay in Japan would also transform Angela Carter's style, and it became even more self-consciously, I think, speculative and experimental. As in The Infernal Design Machines of Dr. Hoffman, which was published in 1972, but written in Japan. One anonymous reviewer wrote something that is in fact very telling and I think very true about this book. He or she described the book as, I quote, a philosophical, magical phantasmagoria of a novel, full of linguistic and logical games that reads, according to one critic, as if it had been translated from the Spanish, end of quote. This is very interesting. There's something Borgesian about it. So not only Japanese, but also harking back to Spanish and Spanish literature. A few years later, translating the fairy tales of Charles Perrault during the hot summer of 1976 was another eye-opener when Carter discovered the familiar stories anew, as I suggested before. That, I think, was the third key event in my opinion. Perrault's late 17th century French stimulated her philological curiosity, her curiosity for not only foreign languages, but also the historicity, if you like, of language and languages generally. And this also inspired her own responses in The Bloody Chamber. Carter's engagement with the fairy tale tradition was probably a lifelong one. Okay, she was familiar with the Grimmskindl House Märchen collection from childhood, albeit in an English translation. The discovery of Perrault's take on Bluebeard, Little Red Riding Hood, Puss in Boots, and Sleeping Beauty as a translator in 1976 was a true eye-opener and made a big difference, I think. Not only did she go on to borrow plot elements, motives, and characters from the stories, but she was, I believe, centrally inspired by certain specific words. Thus, the word cabinet, which resonates from Carter's The Bloody Chamber to Alice in Prague or The Curious Room, owes something to Charles Perrault's La Barbe Bleue, Bluebeard, or so I would like to argue briefly. When translating the fairy tales of Charles Perrault, Carter probably noticed that the word cabinet is curiously repeated 11 times in Perrault's very brief Conte of La Barbe Bleue. In her translation for children, Perrault's cabinet, petit cabinet, becomes a mere little room, and Carter even tries to tone down the horror of the scene as much as possible. She notably removes the aestheticizing image of the female bodies mirrored in their own blood. In The Bloody Chamber, so in her rewriting for adults, however, she does exactly the opposite. In particular, she activates some of the meanings contained in the French word. The cabinet can therefore be seen as the matrix out of which the bloody chamber grew, the semantic richness and implications of the word furnishing material for Carter's own rewriting in The Bloody Chamber, which links Bluebeard's murders explicitly to the pictorial tradition, including religious paintings of saints and martyrs. According to Antoine Furtier's Dictionnaire universel, first published in 1690, cabinet is itself a cabinet-like word that contains several related meanings. The farthest removed room in the apartment of a palace, a small room for study, a bathroom, a curiosity cabinet where antiques and artistic wonders are stored, and an artfully made piece of furniture with drawers to keep precious objects, including secret drawers. In his Dictionnaire de la langue françoise ancienne et moderne, 1680, Pierre Richelet also defines cabinet as a small room to store paintings, and he signals that there are very curious ones in Paris. The cabinet therefore associates privacy, secrecy, art, learning, curios, and curiosity, as well as low bodily functions. Le cabinet, le petit cabinet can also mean the loo, toilets. We note that in Perrault's tale, the forbidden room is located at the end of the gallery, a geographical proximity that strengthens the link between the paintings that decorated the galleries of the palaces of the wealthy and the bloody bodies of the murdered wives stored away in the private little room. Carter, attentive translator and imaginative reader that she was, couldn't resist exploring this connection in her own bloody chamber as an occasion to reflect on the killing of women as a favorite subject, not only women actually, but as a favorite subject of religious iconography. Unsurprisingly, the feminist writer was struck by the condemnation of female curiosity in Perrault's moral, but she was also aware of the fact that it is tongue-in-cheek. It is an ironic moral, une morale enjouée, as it was known back then. So she responded to it in The Bloody Chamber, in part to rehabilitate curiosity, at least intellectual curiosity, as a moral function. The rewriting in The Bloody Chamber revisits but also reclaims the master's cabinet, which symbolizes his power and tyranny over women as a space for female creation. Carter indeed insisted on the importance of intellectual curiosity, and this as something that is activated in and through translation. After this rather long detour via Baudelaire and Perrault, let's now briefly return to Carter's lifelong fascination for Alice's adventures in Wonderland, languages, translation, and speculation. And you will see that it is part of the same sort of layering of texts and echoes, literary echoes. Like Lewis Carroll, Carter used wordplay to quicken the intellect and unlock new imaginative doors. Because foreign languages confront the learner with the challenge of making sense of enigmatic words and arcane grammar and syntax, unusual rhythms and sounds, it brings an unsettling realization that no two languages are similar. It also makes cultural difference and historical difference perceptible, palpable. This experience is not unlike stepping through the looking glass. As such, it provokes wonder about language and its relation to the world and to the self. As we know, Carroll's books memorably capture the shock and delight, the epistemological dizziness and imaginative response inherent in this experience, which is also a learning experience. That is perhaps its moral. Interestingly, even the word that has come to define Carroll's fiction in English, Wonderland, was borrowed from German Romantic poetry, specifically the poems of Wunderland by Schiller and Eichendorff. When Carroll changed the title from Alice's Adventures Underground, which was the title for the 1864 version, to Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, published in 1865, he deliberately gave a foreign feel to his own work that exemplifies the way words, texts, and genres travel and are constantly reinvented anew across languages, literatures, and cultures. References to Alice's Adventures in Wonderland are scattered through Carter's fiction over nearly 30 years, from the whimsical 1963 poem Through the Looking Glass, nodding at Carroll's nursery metaphysics, to the short story Alice in Prague or The Curious Room, published posthumously in American Ghosts and Old World Wonders, which combines philosophical speculation and scatological humor. In the early poem, Carter revisits the opening scene of Through the Looking Glass when Alice falls asleep in the Victorian drawing room and dreams that she crosses over into the depths of the mirror's reflection, where she ponders, I quote, "The books are something like our books, only the words go the wrong way," end of quote. And as you probably remember, Alice asks her cat, "How would you like to live in Looking Glass House, Kitty? I wonder if they'd give you milk in here, in there. Perhaps Looking Glass milk isn't good to drink. But oh, Kitty, now we come to the passage. You can just see a little peep of the passage in Looking Glass House." In another moment, Alice was through the glass and had jumped lightly down into the looking glass room. End of quote. Carter's take in the poem, in her own poem, is whimsically profound in a kind of Borgesian fashion, irreverent and funny. And I suspect, or I have hypothesized, that it possibly puns with peep and peed. I quote, "Waking, Alice shook her kitten, demanding, 'Which dreamed it?' And it peed with fright. And the nursery grew rank with metaphysics." end of quote. So this is one of Carter's early poems dating back to 1963 when she was 23 years old. But I would like to give you another example of the another moment of her life when she reactivated the Carolian intertext. And this was when she was in Japan, when she used it repeatedly. So Carter used the motif of the milk in the mirror to capture her experience of Japan when she compared herself to a modern-day Alice, to convey the radical sense of self-estrangement, of being and living and even getting lost in Tokyo. I quote, "Japan is like going through the looking glass and finding out what kind of milk it is that looking glass cats drink. The same, but totally other." End of quote. Interestingly, in her diary, Carter also relates the mirror effect to the uncanny experience of hearing her own name echoed back in translation, as it were. In her notebook, she mentions hearing her name repeated over and over during lovemaking with Sozo Araki. I quote, "with that immensely alien, thick, dark intonation, the voice issuing from a throat in which the chords had for 23 years been issuing a barking, clicking, uninflected language in which there are no endearments." End of quote. So hearing her name resonating in translation, as it were, in uncanny fashion, captures the immeasurable distance that paradoxically lies at the heart of physical intimacy, but perhaps also the inevitable difference at the core of identity that is only fully grasped in translation. Many years later, Carter returned to the mysterious little room in a text that was published posthumously, Alice in Prague, or The Curious Room. She read a first version of that story in Basel at the 1989 annual conference of the Swiss Association of University Teachers of English. And Neil Forsyth, my thesis director, was one of them. The first version of that story was published in a volume that was put together shortly before her death from lung cancer. One of the last stories she ever wrote, Alice in Prague, or The Curious Room, revisits the motif of the strange room in the looking glass one more time, one last time, while drawing up connections between the Italian painter Arcimboldo, the British alchemist John Dee, the English fantasist Lewis Carroll, and the contemporary Prague animator Jan Schwankmeyer through the conjuring magic of writing. Alice in Prague, or The Curious Room, is dedicated to Jan Schwankmeyer, the animator of Prague, and his film of Alice. In the paper version delivered at the conference in Basel, Carter reflects on the process of translation as transmediation in a section called Introductory Speculations, where she explains that the short story she's about to read to the audience begins with, I quote, "Alice said, 'Now you are going to listen to a story,' end of quote." Whereas Schwankmeyer describes, I quote, "the formal parameters of what is to follow," end of quote, by telling the audience, I quote, "Now you are going to see a film," end quote. It is noteworthy that in the volume of conference proceedings put together by Margaret Bridges, Carter's story begins, I quote, Alice said, now you are reading a story, end of quote. So medium and form matter for Carter. The version of the story published in the American Ghosts and Old World Wonders collection does not include these considerations about form and medium. Okay, all the speculative, introductory speculations part is removed. The curious room referred to in the title of the story activates meanings of the cabinet that Carter hadn't explored yet, including the cabinet of curiosities that she spontaneously associated with Archduke Rudolph's collection of wonders in Prague. And she also activated the meaning of cabinet as privy, which in a typical association of the high and the low becomes an occasion to meditate on life and death. Carter also explicitly associates Rudolph's curiosity with transgressive knowledge, the Enlightenment, and the Bluebeard story. Beckoning the reader to enter the forbidden room, Alice in Prague and the Curious Room begins as follows. In the city of Prague, once it was winter. Outside the Curious Room, there is a sign on the door which says, forbidden. Inside, oh, come and see, the celebrated Dr. D. The celebrated Dr. D, looking for all the world like Santa Claus, is contemplating his crystal, the fearful sphere that contains everything that is, or was, or ever shall be. Another optical toy and tool, like the magic mirror. Carter's story imagines the historical Dr. D conducting experiments in the Curious Room where the Archduke Rudolph keeps his priceless collection of treasures. Among the objects cluttering this marvelous cabinet stands a crystal ball that Dr. D, helped by his assistant, Ned Kelly, uses to conjure up an angel. In Carter's story, the angel that appears to the alchemist and his assistant is no other than Alice herself. I quote, "She was kneeling on the mantelpiece of the sitting room, looking at herself in the mirror. Bored, she breathed on the glass until it clouded over, and then with her finger, she drew a door. The door opened," end quote. And so Alice, and of course, Alice as an angel is also Angela as angel and Angie. So Alice crosses Carol's text over to Carter's fantasized Renaissance Prague to ask the marveling alchemist a number of riddles in the Carolian mode, in fact. One last meaning of cabinet activated in Carter's story, as I said earlier, is privy, which in this case is situated at the top of the tower of the alchemist's workshop. It's a hole in the floor behind a cupboard door, situated under another privy with another hole, above another privy, another hole, and so on. The narrator adds, "Women loathe this privy. Happily few venture here into the magician's tower, where Archduke Rudolph keeps his collection of wonders, his proto-museum, his Wunderkammer, his cabinet curiosité, that curious room of which he speaks," end quote. The juxtaposition of the English collection of wonders with Wunderkammer and cabinet curiosité reflects the author's delight in foreign words and literary traditions as the site where language takes a life of its own. To quote Carter herself in the preface to On Strangeness. Foreign words and works thus offer a playful textual clue to the connecting rooms of Carter's own fictional chamber and a peep into her own metaphysical playroom. As Carter's example suggests, then, crossing boundaries of language, genre, period, culture, and medium keeps one's sense of wonder alive and strengthens a belief in the intellectual, artistic, and even moral function of curiosity that is centrally activated by translation, so that more new wine is poured into old bottles. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Martine. What a wonderful presentation, wonderfully rich, and I'm sure there are going to be questions. So can I invite our audience to please put your questions in the Q&A. Gosh, there's so much that one can take and take up from your presentation, Martine. I wonder if I could start the questions with a methodological question, because I was interested in the quite extensive use that you're making in throughout your presentation of the archival material in the British Library. And I wonder if you could just say a bit more about the Angela Carter that you've been finding in that archive, because archives can work in so many different ways, can't they, vis-a-vis the kind of the public writer that we know and the published writer. And it seems as though in the Carter archive, it seems as if it's incredibly rich and a really important addition to our understanding of her and her work. And I wonder if you are finding then a kind of more experimental, more playful Angela Carter in her archive, which perhaps then is toned down in the work, or is it kind of what one might expect, or is it something very novel?
It's a very interesting question, because for a start, what I found when I started researching this archive was what I wanted to try and find was evidence of the fact that her translation of Perrault's texts had a kind of generative effect, you know, or could be connected, could be linked to the rewritings collected in the Bloody Chamber. And that was quite a number of years ago. And when the archives were sort of organized by the librarians at the British Library and opened to at first only a few scholars and then more scholars, I found evidence of that connection. And I also realized that Carter was incredibly knowledgeable about the fairy tale tradition generally, and or including Perrault, that she was a scholar, that she and that she had read extensively, so that she was not only, quote unquote, you know, subverting Perrault or the Grimms or Madame de Beaumont or what have you, even though that seemed to be, if you like, the kind of dominant critical discourse on Carter's fairy tale rewritings at the time. So the archival material enabled me and probably and other scholars, you know, like Anna Watz, for instance, who has worked on Angela Carter's unpublished translation of Xavier Gautier's Surrealisme et Sexualité. I mean, all of a sudden, if you like, a kind of new image of Carter as an extremely learned, thorough, careful, I would say, profound reader and of those texts in context began to emerge. So, so that was one, if you like, one consequence of searching the archives. Something, and of course, maybe I shouldn't have said this from the word go, but it also drew my attention to the fact that there were a lot of works, texts, excerpts that she had translated, but never published for one reason or another, and including texts which were not, how shall I put it, which had been misfiled as quote unquote original text, you know, in the unpublished short stories file, for instance, and which turned out to be translations. So that was also quite fascinating to discover. And there are boxes and boxes of material, of drafts. You can see how Carter kept rewriting her own texts. Well, not unlike Flaubert and Proust and so many other writers, of course, but in a sense, her entire output, her entire work from the early poems until the very end of her life and the short stories collected in American Ghosts and Underground Wonders, in a sense, is one long conversation with manifold sources and with herself also. That's why the idea of, that's why I find Jacobson's threefold model of translation so suggestive, because that's also a kind of, let's say, interesting entry point that enables us to think about Carter's texts, even when they are very different texts, you know, the cultural criticism, the translations, quote unquote, for children, the journalism, the novels, the short fiction, even, and let alone the radio plays and the film script, you know, they are all interwoven, which says something very interesting about how translation enables us to complicate a generic, I mean, neat or too neat, you know, generic distinctions, including between theory, you know, the kind of speculative mode, and the fictional mode. Anyway, sorry, I'm.
A wonderfully full answer. Thank you. Talking of speculation, I have a speculative question from you coming up, but let me just, well, actually, let me just say one thing. As I was listening to your presentation and the wonderful interrelation between Carter and Baudelaire, it struck me, I've been thinking about the Baudelaire bicentenary, which is coming up on the 9th of April, I think, and thank you so much for allowing us through our research seminar series to mark the Baudelaire bicentenary as well. There have been a number of comments in the chat from Charlotte Crofts. Hello, Charlotte. Fabulous presentation. Thank you, Martine. I think Alice in Prague is quoted in the BBC Two omnibus documentary and informed the form that it took, lingering shots of a curious room. But it was great to hear about its genesis at the conference. So an observation from Charlotte there. Ulka Yusuf, really interesting presentation. Thank you, Madam Martine. And one more point, your way of introducing the topic was fascinating. Thank you, Ulka. I mentioned then I have a speculative question. This was Caleb Sivia's was first out of the blocks with a question: had Carter lived longer, might she have wanted to publish more translations? Or if this is too speculative, what work or author would you like her to have translated? I think that's a really, really nice question. Thank you, Caleb. Martine, so had she lived longer, might she have wanted to publish more translations in your view? Or if that's too speculative, what work or author would you like her to have translated?
So hello to Charlotte. And hello to Caleb, of course, and to fellow Carterians, dear to my heart, with whom I've been having wonderful conversations and exchanges. Caleb's question is fantastic, and of course, so what I can say is only very speculative. At first, she meant to publish, her translation of Xavier Gautier's Surréalisme et Sexualité. So she took the trouble to translate this whole book. I mean, I have a copy of it here, somewhere. Sorry. Yes, I have a dilapidated copy of Surréalisme et Sexualité. Dilapidated, really, but in the edition that Carter used, I mean, not her own edition, but the same edition, Xavier Gautier, Surréalisme et Sexualité, idée and a half, so which Carter translated into English. This was meant to be published. I mean, her English translation was published, was supposed to be published. Maybe it was even commissioned to her. I don't remember exactly. Anna Watz would know the answer to this question. But the fact is that two anonymous readers faulted it with being, I quote, full of isms and jargon, end quote. And Carter was so upset, so annoyed, so that she said, okay, there's no way I'm publishing my translation or this translation, and it's still unpublished. By the way, it also enabled her to engage critically with Gautier. I mean, there's a very interesting note, where she basically says, no, Gautier is generalizing, so she has an axe to grind, a kind of feminist axe to grind, and it blinds her to very important differences between surrealists. Anyway, so probably that's something that she meant to publish, but that wasn't published in the end. I think that at the 12 Petit Poème en prose by Baudelaire, speaking of the anniversary, that Carter translated would be very interesting to publish, because you can really see how she began to think about, meditate almost on some words, and how certain words begin to resonate in I think, or maybe I'm just going crazy, and indeed, I've fallen into my own, hole, down the rabbit hole, but I don't know. I mean, there comes a point when I really don't know if I'm just, yes, going a bit mad. But for instance, speaking of the words of the name Venus, I think that in Black Venus, there's definitely a kind of pun, Venus, the embodiment of, woman, brought down to earth and including in the materiality of a diseased body, venereal disease. But in one of Baudelaire's Petits Poèmes en prose, you have a word which is a coinage, which doesn't exist, which is vénustre, un habit de vénustre. So it's like an habit de Venus, except made funny, mispronounced or twisted. And Carter is hesitating at this point, because how do you translate a word that doesn't exist, basically? And I think I'm just giving you one example of some of the resonances that would be very, very interesting to explore. Maybe the translation is, if you like, extremely suggestive in this sense. There are wonderful translations, of course, published translations of Baudelaire's Petits Poèmes en prose, but Carter's own is a kind of matrix, very interesting matrix. So in that sense, it would be worth publishing.
I wonder, following on from your that word vénustre, there's a nice question from Juliette Taylor-Batty. Thank you for your fascinating presentation. How much do we know from the archives, etc., about how Carter found the experience of translation? Do we know how difficult she found it? Have you seen any evidence of her grappling with untranslatability, for example?
That's a very interesting question, because the problem is that, as far as I know, I haven't read all the archives. I mean, there are boxes and boxes and boxes of material, notebooks, drafts, correspondence. So there is indeed quite a lot of material. I think that very few people have actually read it all. Maybe Caleb, I don't know. I've read most of those documents, but not all of them. In what I have read, I haven't found evidence of Carter's, let's say, discussing her translation work. There are, of course, words that she looks up and that she defines, and things that you can try and elicit from, for instance, the fireworks, jotting down words in different languages and translations. But it's mostly I'm trying to reconstruct, how she was translating and to what effect. As far as I know, she didn't really discuss what it meant to her, if you like. It's a pity, because it would be so fascinating to have more evidence. As Andrew Gordon, and I have his, of course, his autobiography of Carter somewhere in one of my piles. Yes, Angela Carter, a biography by Edmund Gordon. And the title of his biography is, and it's such an apt title, The Invention of Angela Carter, a biography. So my sense also is that there are things that she didn't want to talk about, and that she deliberately hid from view. My impression is that the role, the key role played by translation, is perhaps deliberately something that she didn't want to draw too much attention to. But that's perhaps not very fair of me to say so. Once more, I'm speculating here.
It's coming up to 1/2 past, but with everyone's permission, I hope we can just take a couple more questions, because the questions have been really coming through on the Q&A, and there's one in particular from Amalia Kalinescu that has been upvoted to the top of the list. And Amalia says, "Thank you so much for your enlightening presentation. I'd like to know your thoughts on a topic dear to my heart. Angela Carter was instrumental in Kazuo Ishiguro's becoming the renowned writer that he is today. What do you think helped her more to see Ishiguro's bicultural background as a rich source of inspiration? Could it be her prowess as a translator, as well as her writing and teaching skills, or her love for Japan and Japanese, or all of them together?"
Yet another very interesting question. That's true. Kazuo Ishiguro, who took Carter's classes, I think. So he's one more example of someone who was somehow, inspired by Ishiguro's writings. I have read a number of books by Ishiguro, but I would be hard pressed, if you like, to try and think about connections, if you like, deeper connections between Carter and Ishiguro. But I don't know, has he ever discussed this in interviews, for instance? Is there a sense in which he sort of took Carter's way of working as a model, and perhaps even did fireworks play a particularly important role for him as a British author of Japanese origin? I've no idea. Does the
Can I invite Amalia to
yes,
say a bit
Amalia.
more in the Q&A if there's anything in particular you'd like to add to the question? Can I as well perhaps move on to a question from, by way of a comment from Elton Uliana that's also been upvoted. Just a comment, fascinating talk, very timely as well, as writers and theorists are increasingly focused their attention on the ways translation influences writing. And a question from Ruth Chester. Thank you for the presentation. I really liked your description of learning a foreign language as like stepping through a looking glass. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit about how we might use that metaphor to think about the translator's role. So bringing you back to the title of your talk and the image then of stepping through the looking glass as a way of thinking about the translator's role. And Ruth Chester asked if you could say a little more about that image.
Yeah. I used that image, partly because of the central role played by the Alice books. I mean, both Alice books, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, for Angela Carter. So from her early childhood up until, well, perhaps, the last story she wrote, or one of the last short stories she ever wrote. So that was what made me think of the milk in the looking glass thing. The experience of Japan as stepping through the looking glass, which she really, activated during her stay in Japan, to capture her experience of what it was like to live in Japan, try and fail to learn Japanese, and even though she read a number of books, and even though she about Japan by Japanese authors, and even though she tried to learn the language, so that was my connections. But more generally, I think that sometimes, because of, I don't know, Google Translate, or because of kind of sense of translation as something that is relatively unproblematic. We tend to think of translation as a kind of transparent, fluid kind of process of transference, transposition. And of course, literary translation draws our attention, and that's central to the fact that that's not true. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't mean that there is a kind of incommensurability between languages and hence, human beings, literatures, cultures. Otherwise, that would be terrible. Otherwise, that would be death. So it's both like a mirror and like something that shapes and reshapes, transforms, slightly, subtly alters. It's like the milk in the mirror, not the same milk, but a bit other, not radically other. What does it mean to drink the milk in the mirror? So that I think that it says something about, of course, literary translation generally, and even translation against the commonplace of translation as a transparent mirror, as a mirror that merely reproduces something. It's something more mysterious, but something. The Perraultian mirror is more mysterious, more magical. It makes you think. It makes you wonder. An extraordinary word. Look it up in the OED. A kind of cabinet-like word too. So that's what it does to you. It makes your mind spin. And that's the beauty and the magic of it. I don't know if I have answered the question, but
Martine, you have, and I think with that notion of the mind spinning, I think that encapsulates perfectly what we've really just enjoyed. I think through the wonderful resonances of your presentation and of your answers to our questions. I think we're going to need to wrap up now, but can I just perhaps close by citing a question, but which we won't have time for you to answer, unfortunately, from Anna Kershi, or Kerchi, who asks, thinking about the visual, the optical metaphor, can Carter's cabinet also be connected to the dark room and photography, so important in Lewis Carroll's life? In Carter's short story Wolf Alice, the experience of being on the wrong side of the mirror is somehow connected to a photographic metaphor, if I remember well. And I was also led to reflect, if I may put it that way, on a previous presenter in our BCLT research seminar series, and that's Matthew Reynolds from Oxford, and his work and his notion of prismatic translation, which it seems to me that your presentation has a lot in common with. The idea then of the translation like a prism releasing multiple signifying possibilities. And I think your presentation today has shown us really just how rich that process of the toing and froing, as you put it, between translations and intertexts in Angela Carter's work is. So before we wrap up, let me just give a brief advertisement for a couple of events that we have coming up in our research seminar series. We have a final research seminar of this semester coming up after Easter, when Sophie Stevens will be speaking on theatre translation towards the end of April, and details for that seminar will be going up on Eventbrite shortly. But well before that, next week on Thursday, March the 25th, we have a book launch symposium for Emily Rose's new study, Translating Trans Identity, Writing, Rewriting, Undecidable Texts and Bodies. So we have a book launch symposium Thursday of next week, 4 p.m. UK time, and Serena Bassi from Yale and William Sperlin from Brunel will be in discussion with Emily Rose herself about the themes of her book. And a final mention, since we've had a breath of bracing Swiss air in today's seminar, courtesy of Martine.
It's pretty chilly. There's snow, outside. Window.
Just to mention that at this year's BCLT Summer School in July, we have bursaries for translators from 2 Swiss languages, French and Romansh, courtesy of the Swiss Cultural Foundation Pro Helvetia. And so if you haven't yet had a look at the details for the BCLT Summer School, that's in July. We have 11 different parallel workshops at the summer school, and details are on the BCLT website, bclt.org.uk. Enough advertisements. We need to thank you, Martine. I realized I didn't give you a chance to respond to any of those.
If I may,
hovering on the verge of a response, please.
If I may, very briefly, Anna Keshi, hello, Anna. Lovely to know that you were here, to use a strange deictic these days. And indeed, the optical tools, the optical toys, or optical toys abound in Angela Carter's writing. And of course, it's a very, very suggestive metaphor, which draws our attention to the fact that Carter was also very much interested in the interplay of text and image and what it means to, quote unquote, translate a text, a text into an image and vice versa, as another modality of the Carolian mirror. And speaking of Matthew Reynolds, I invited Matthew a couple of years ago to Lausanne to talk about his project on prismatic translation, and he has since published, I think, something on Jane Eyre and translations of Jane Eyre into a whole number of different languages. So he came to talk about his concept of the prism, anyway, and he has worked on the creativity of translation in his first book in particular. That's very important. Anyway, I need to stop, otherwise I'll carry on. My students know that once I start and I tend to get carried away. So indeed, that time is.
We do need to wrap up. We have a question from Luz Miranda Valencia. Will the recording be on the BCLT website? It will shortly be going up on the BCLT YouTube channel. So do look out there for the recording, and you can catch up afterwards. For now, though, we need to wrap up. It's been such a wonderful occasion, Martine. Thank you so much again for a really rich presentation, and thank you for the generosity of your responses to our questions as well. Thank you, everybody, for putting those questions. And I'm sorry we weren't able to answer quite every question, but we did pretty well. So thank you, Martine, once again. Thank you, everybody, and hope to see you again.